ambassadors, distinguished guests, and friends in the policy community and media. Once again, thank you very much. Good morning, and thank you very much for giving me this singular and very timely opportunity, General Saab, at CPSD, which has been one of the most frontline think tanks in bringing key priority issues to such forums. And I think the idea here is to unpack really what's going on today in Kashmir, the region, and perhaps its impact globally, as well as to see, which we are doing very exhaustively in Parliament, what policy options are available to Pakistan. Now, given that General Saab covered a fair amount of ground, and very solid one at that, there is of course a moral hazard in overlapping a little bit, but I think I'm going to have to live with that because these are important subjects. And not so much a moral hazard as a listener fatigue worry. Yeah. But I think this is a subject that we need to iterate new positions on, as well as reiterate very crucial, shall we say, axioms of policy that have become reduced to cliches, and we need to wake them up. I think that is one of our opportunities today, and I'm going to speak to how August 5th has actually marked a crossroads in history, not just for South Asia, but actually also beyond the region and also the world. I think it is Pakistan's job now, unfortunately, it has landed on Pakistan to be the sole purveyor of that kind of knowledge, to generate that knowledge and to purvey that knowledge. And this is one of those times I think we can look into how we amplify our message and create some new thoughts, and thought leaders bring their attention to it. So firstly, let us look at what India has inadvertently actually done. The idea was to effect an annexation while they thought Pakistan was busy and consumed with its own problems. Be that as it may, I think this has horribly backfired. Now, how has it backfired? One, it has internationalized the Kashmir dispute on a scale that only Jawaharlal Nehru did in 1948. Modi's action, of course, is qualitatively and fundamentally different from that earlier attempt to internationalize, as there was the public view was to seek UN intervention at that time. And it was ostensibly to seek and ascertain the views of the Kashmiris, as there was a gridlock and stalemate between the Indian Federation and Pakistan and Kashmir as to where they will go. So it was about their right of self-determination. And before we proceed further, and I will reiterate this again, is that we should not forget, especially media debates tend to forget, in our horror at the human rights tragedy unfolding in Kashmir today, in Indian-held Kashmir today, we forget that it is really fundamentally a right of a people to decide how they govern themselves. So that right of self-determination remains really the core issue. That is what they are fighting about. India has created a layer of oppressions and state oppressions and laws that provide that impunity. But let us not forget that it is also the inalienable right of self-determination that this intrepid population is fighting for literally over 4 generations with different rulers. So while Nehru's view was to seek UN intervention for different reasons, and I say ostensible because I'm not sure at all, given different readings of history and reviews of history, what was the intention. Jawaharlal Nehru also very quickly reviewed it the minute Pakistan, for instance, allied with the United States. And that has completely gone the opposite way today, and suggested in many books which are available in open source information that once Pakistan is an ally of a powerful state, the scenario changes fundamentally for India, and they will review their right to a plebiscite. And I'm happy to provide those papers. I've been coming across them lately. So I think the intent had started changing very early on for the Indian government. So let's not glorify what that intent was. But having said that, let's look at today. Today, Narendra Modi has unwittingly internationalized the Kashmir dispute. I think we all note that. And if nothing else, it has become a cause of embarrassment to India, either privately or publicly. Certainly privately, it has become in international circles a talking point to bring up with an Indian team if at some point they give pause for any such issue to be discussed. So I'm not suggesting that there's a tidal wave of global condemnation. No, that is what we are talking about today. But I think that has become part of our job, really, part of where we bring the shoulder to this wheel. And we have been talking, I think the last speech spoke very eloquently to what has been happening for over 3 to 4 weeks in Kashmir. Look at what happened. As the implications of what New Delhi has actually unilaterally done unfolded first in Pakistan, it is also global capitals that have been actually digesting what India has been up to in this closed valley, if you like, close to information, close to scrutiny, close to unmogip observers, which are duly meant to be reporting, but closed. They allow them, but they don't allow them to report. So it really is a global issue. And why is it a global issue? It's a global issue because there is no precedence in global history for two nuclear countries to be cheek by jowl with each other, to be actual geographical neighbors with a great history of conflict. I won't mention the history of overlap and partition, but which was one of the most traumatic events of again, human history, but a history of war and conflict, and even militaries facing off against each other. And I'm sure the militaries are better equipped to tell you, and this will be unpacked, at what level of military formations India has actually posed against Pakistan, which is really quite extraordinary and should, I think, be discussed through the day in terms of what they see as a threat and what they are aligning themselves to do. Some threats have been actually pointed out, and we will go towards those. But just let's come back to making this one key point. This is not a problem that can be dealt with by India. I think we're all clear on that. But perhaps the world is not. And that worm is turning. And India's done it entirely to itself. It's shot itself in the foot, as some newspapers were saying today. That worm is turning, but it is not, forget it being a bilateral issue, which it has gone, India has gone against the spirit of even the Shimla Treaty and the Lahore Declaration, which both, incidentally, they allowed for bilateral dialogue, but both, for clarity, did not at all move away from the fact that this was still an international dispute and the territory was held under a UN Charter of Discussion and Action. So it's neither a bilateral issue anymore, it's neither, or certainly not an Indian issue, which is the attempt by the Indian current state and has been in the past, but it is now an international issue again in a real sense. It has been in Pakistan's view and Kashmiri's view and the United Nations view. But we have seen how far that view went and what interventions, if you like, were made. So now here we have, this is a global issue. At no point have two nuclear neighbors been at this level of a flashpoint. And I will now quote President Clinton and remind everybody of his prescience in calling Kashmir the most dangerous flashpoint in the world. So I'm hammering this point, which is to suggest it cannot be a local, regional issue. What stays in Kashmir, what goes on in Kashmir will not stay in Kashmir. We hope it will. We hope it will be diplomatically and politically advanced, but let us hope that the volatility does not spill over. We have discussed it. But you know, but if you are gaming any scenario, and you will have seen 5 minutes ago, that volatility in the region spilling over into Pakistan, even false flag operations, all of the above are to be gamed very really, very seriously as potential crises. And the fire that has been ignited by the Modi government, I'm loath to call it a government, its actions really strike me of those of a regime or a junta that is drunk on its own power and Kool-Aid of Hindutva and neo-fascism and nationalism. And of course, that's not the whole of India. There are brave voices speaking out, so we must never paint one nation with one brush. But the fire that has been ignited has the potential to engulf a much wider region. And I don't think I need to belabor this point now. My second point is that what else has India done? It has miscalculated dangerously in underrating the scale and capacity and power of Kashmiri dissent. It did not calculate for this. It thought years of oppression, state torture, and one of the things is the memos. I think there's no other example globally of such mass blindings, such level of mass blindings, and the stories coming out on social media of torture, of random, arbitrary state brutality. Despite years of that, because that was also happening. It is not just unleashed today. It was also happening, as many of us know and keep repeating. But that story was contained. It was contained very deliberately and expeditiously, constantly by India. That story was contained. And now what has happened is that India has exposed its own spectacular failure of democracy. That's its internal problem. It can be failing its own self. But it has also let the story slip out of its hands because it did not calculate on how many Kashmiris and against what odds will break the curfew. Because that's what they're doing. They're breaking a curfew. They're not breaking a lockdown. Let's be very clear. There's a difference between a lockdown and a curfew. They are breaking a state-imposed curfew day after day. In different parts of Kashmir, we are even getting messages from parts of held Kashmir where the signal perhaps is the control towers of this state of the Indian state are not strong enough. Baramulla, Sopore, many. And the cries are heart-rending of help, of assistance, and also of reminders to parliamentarians, because we are in touch, it's our job to be in touch. And what is the point of having interlocutors in India if you're not able to be in touch? And one of the things they are telling us is, remember that even if we are locked down and in curfew, our fealty, our scars are, and when we ask what is, how are you hurting, how can we help, the blood, the scars, the torture are now marks of our fidelity to our Kashmiri identity. This is a people under severe war by a state. India is conducting war, I'm sorry. This has to be called what it is. and it is a curfew. The lockdown may be a communications one. And this morning's Al Jazeera story will tell you, and others, I don't know if it's Al Jazeera, but tell you about how journalists are risking their lives. Today's story is how journalists are risking their lives. It has now become a life hazard for international journalists as well to report from inside Kashmir. So I would take this opportunity to congratulate and pay tribute to all those journalists who are doing that, and even journalists within India. Some of them are actually risking more than their own lives and their families. And we hope that they will continue to do so and remain safe. So clearly, second point, this story is not holding, and India stands exposed with a grisly underbelly of state torture and democratic subversion spilling out. It's all spilling out. They're trying very hard to contain it. The whole strategy was contain the story, forget everything, for years on end. Today's New York Times starts with Hong Kong, and today there's nothing, I looked through it, there's nothing in it on Kashmir. They must be working very hard, understand this, to contain this story. But I predict it will be out again in a few days. Other outlets will bring it up. The Guardian in the UK, the Independent in the UK are also on the front line of that reporting, and they will continue to do so. So the story is out, and social media, that unwieldy, unpredictable, anarchic beast that we so like to hate when it is peddling hate narratives, because it does, is where this information frontline war is being waged. And I won't go into that because that's a separate conversation, and I'm sure somebody will do that in the afternoon, but that's really what's going on. The manufactured consent within India about Kashmir may hold in New Delhi because they have convinced themselves of a state narrative, and there are many conscientious or previously conscientious observers who would have not, should not have bought into it, but have. But what is important is that there is an open fault line now. The accommodations and bargains that India sought, so this is the third point, the accommodations and bargains that India sought within Kashmir from Sheikh Rashid's time, from when Article 370 came in, from when, as he says, the lollipop was offered, and that is why Pakistan does not recognize this lollipop. It's not germane to our position or relevant to our position on Kashmir. Pakistan does not recognize the accession because this is held territory under a UN charter. So 370 is irrelevant to it, but the Indian attempt to even alter that has caused a snowball effect that has run out of control. So the Indian leadership, the Kashmiri leadership that sought accommodations with Kashmir is all in lockdown, and they can no longer even go to their voters, I imagine, and I think that's not too far out in my imagination, that they can no longer even appeal to Kashmiriyat if they now strike an accommodation or political bargain with the Modi regime. And that was the principal ploy that Indira Gandhi used to use from that time onwards to stifle dissent and divide and rule. Old trick, old ploy. I think colonialism has its history repeating itself, but that's just been upended. So thirdly, so that's changed. For jobs and wealth and all of that's changed. It has now become a badge of political identity to rebel against the Modi Sarkar. New Delhi has done this without taking any Kashmiri into confidence. Big mistake, just a terrible tactical mistake. But it's happened now. And whoever makes that accommodation now to become a CM of sorts or anything will risk the opprobrium of the very politicized, angry, resistance-hardened Kashmiri people. So that's the third thing that's happened. Fourthly, and I'll move as fast as I can, there will be, of course, a test of diplomacy, because there will constantly, and there is already a narrative in India, and this is one of the policy tools Pakistan is deficient in and has been, is, well, telling its story and not being able to talk about changed facts on the ground. India has created facts on the ground, or tried to, like Israel has done in Palestine. Those facts are not being accepted, so the fact is not holding. But the facts that Pakistan has created in moving back from its old policy of non-state actors, and I'm going to say it because it's been said by the Prime Minister and everybody else, is obviously not a policy tool or an option today. And Pakistan has to make that very clear. That's going to be one of the narrative warfare issues that India will use. Excuse me. We need to start saying, well, maybe jihad was cool in the 1980s when Washington thought it was cool too in Afghanistan. It's not anymore. We don't think so. We are engaged. And the fact is, it is the fact of the matter. We are engaged in one of the largest inland wars against militancy and terrorism ourselves, and doing quite well, thank you. But maybe not so well against violent extremism, but certainly against terrorism. So here's the thing. There will be this narrative deployment against Pakistan, and we have to be very clear and prepared for that. And Afghanistan will, of course, be brought into the mix, that while there's such an important transition, India has been left out of that bargain. Pakistan has primacy again. This will be an issue that is created, and we must be ready for it. We must also be ready, of course, for false flag operations, which will be internationalized and recast. The indigenous, for instance, insurgency, which shows no sign of going back. I mean, this is the curfew. Imagine what happens when this curfew is removed, even in phases. India's first option, from what it does, from the state of play one sees, that's the first policy toolkit you deploy, is that it will say this indigenous insurgency, spill it over, it will spill over naturally, as will refugees. It is not a hospitable environment, as will refugees, and that will become the false flag operation that India will start talking about. So I think we are being effective in talking about that and warning against it. Where's the fire? Fifthly, the fire is that we've had a Balakot Pulwama episode in February, when India has already, for the first time since 1971, crossed Pakistan's borders. That war too had Indian involvement in it, in a part of Pakistan seceding from it. So naturally there will be a clear focus on how that plays out. Now, in that whole Balakot Pulwama episode, Pakistan's conventional capability in downing those intrusions in those jets, and then that pilot, including that pilot, were very clear. They were demonstrated after a long gap. There's been no occasion for the Pakistan Air Force to demonstrate its conventional capability. And I think that New Delhi was flexing its muscle. Well, it pretty much had to unflex it. I'm not here beating my chest, but that's really what happened. So Pakistan has demonstrated its conventional capability. It has also demonstrated an appetite for diplomacy over military solutions, which leads me to my last point, that Pakistan is now, in giving back that pilot, that Pakistan is now is no longer the revisionist power as such, as India cast it, or rather won't revisionist, India used to cast it as a rogue power. Well, India is no longer the status quo power it always said it was. It is now the revisionist power. And it is not making stable or rational decisions. This must be unpacked. I hope it is today. But states base their responses on rational decisions, some of them based on deterrence, some of them based on other theory. And India has just jettisoned all of that, while Pakistan has stated very clearly that it will give a proportional response. All escalation from India will lead to a proportional response. There is no confusion about that. But Pakistan has not jettisoned diplomacy. Today also consular access to Jadhav is being allowed, and it's what should have been done. States must act according to law. Since we are citing international law, we must act according to law and abide by it as much as possible. It is India which is now, since 2014, moving egregiously in a direction where it is an irrational state actor. Please have a think about that and understand the implications of a huge economy, of a Hindutva extremist ideology in power with nuclear and other defense capabilities. It is the largest military spender in the world. Some of it is being used in Kashmir as the biggest open-air prison in the world and one of the most militarized regions in the world. It's something now, the figures range between 700,000 to 900,000. So, I'm going to end my points here and just quickly, if you like, run through a laundry list of, we have provided policy options actually in a Jinnah Institute brief we have shared and provided. There is of course the conventional policy response, which is the diplomatic one. There is no substitute for that. That is the short-term response, but that too must be pursued more aggressively. There is a way forward. Pakistan has policy options, but there has to be a new narrative. And I think the new narrative should be built on some of these lines discussed. There are many better people than me to build on that. The short-term diplomacy must continue. It must be amplified. But what must it be based on? The talking points have to be current. They have to reflect the new kind of power that India is trying to employ. It became famous for soft power, for cultural diplomacy, for Bollywood, for economic strength. Today, it is only basing its power, it is pivoting its new projection on power that is medieval, that defies all forms of multilateralism and will take the region and the world into a very dark place. This is not some, this is not some TV serial. It's not a Netflix serial. It is very real. So while this kind of power was being exercised by global hegemons, say in Iraq and other places, for it to happen here again in the region should make us think that India is trying to bend history in ways that the world will have to regret if it does not act. Multilateralism is not over. The United Nations has not and cannot collapse even though the United States went against it in Iraq. Its daily calendar of small and big interventions, even the UN Human Rights Declaration, holds the field. And India is upending all of those, including the United Nations' own reports, which the UN can perhaps do little about, because it's the P5 that are running it. But even the P5 cannot walk away from this reuse, this new use of power, this new definition of power that India is attempting to use, this rather medieval definition of power. It trumps all human endeavor on civilization, history, religion, everything. All religions eventually had to move towards civilization. They have to. Otherwise, they're cast aside as terrorism or extremism. And that is the whole project of the reformation of everything, of even the World War II, League of Nations, and then the World War II UN. So India is walking away from that. That is a huge thing. And it will have a fallout. So it will have an impact. It will create its own snowball. Pakistan has to guard against that. Pakistan has to rebuild a narrative that India is now an unstable power. Number two, its hegemonic designs are a threat to global peace. Its exclusionary reshaping of its own democracy in neo-fascist norms and idiom pose a risk to global norms, because they do. And in this world of naked military aggression, as well as impunity being accorded by no intervention, even verbal, we are taking the world, a nuclear region, and the future of young people already at risk from climate change into a very uncertain dystopia. This time, it is not Pakistan that is responsible for small incursions. It never was for a long time. This is a big sea change in world history. Please understand it as that. It is not a story or a people that is being contained by India. And they are proceeding apace with the Naziization of the rest of India. The stories coming out of Muslims floating up on shores of complete exclusion. And I'm using very polite terms. So this cannot be the dystopia we are leading towards. There are important voices in India who are still fighting against this. We must build ties with them and with those Kashmiris who are fighting literally alone. We will not leave them alone. And I think this seminar is a very important token and symbol, a powerful symbol of our voice as our political parties on the ground. And I want to say one more thing, that there has to be an infrastructure, a medium-term policy. There has to be an infrastructure for public diplomacy. This will not just be fought at a state level. This will be done through think tanks, through newspapers, through people talking to each other, through public contact. And that's called public diplomacy. Pakistan needs to have an office for public diplomacy, which was set up incidentally by the PP government and dismantled promptly afterwards. And a cautionary note here might be that India's had a huge one for a long time, an office of public diplomacy. There are think tanks who speak against the state, are given state land, and critical thinking, at least until this government was encouraged. Now they've taken root. So there are partnerships and interveners internationally for India. It's called Brookings India and Carnegie India. They have stuck their Velcro on of ideas and a manufactured, perhaps, set of ideas, but they have, to these think tanks which at least have been critically thinking at the right time, and maybe they won't now, they won't be. Every think tank in the world comes together at times of existential crisis, and mark my words, India too has put itself in an existential crisis, just like Pakistan's think tanks would. And this is one place where that is happening. But where are those 1,000 flowers blooming? NGOs, INGOs are not living in a state of intellectual freedom today, and that's something we must think about. That which we suppress very often is what that we need. So we need to think about that. And lastly, one quick point is that we will be as strong as our economy and our public consensus. There is a public consensus on Kashmir. There is a public consensus on Kashmir. That is one thing warring political parties agree on. And even in a very fraught session in Parliament, the resolution, the joint resolution, as the president of AJK here will tell you, or he certainly was witness to it and a key instrument in it, was drafted together and made stronger together and more resolute together, which I think should send a powerful signal to the world. And with those words, I will thank my guest, my host, and the guests for listening with such patience, and hope that we will have the reports from this conference with us, because I think it's very timely and extremely useful. Remember, even one voice, let alone many, even one voice is important, and I think that is the project we are here to amplify. So thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for reinforcing that Kashmir is a global issue.